Hello, AP Bio. In this video, I'm going to talk about natural selection. I'm going to introduce Unit 7, and the first concept that we're going to talk about is evolution, as defined by Charles Darwin as descent with modification. So let's go to your notes and let's talk about natural selection. So the first thing let's do is let's define what evolution means, and let's connect what the term natural selection means to the term evolution, because you've probably heard of evolution and you may or may not have heard of natural selection. I want to connect those two things together. So Charles Darwin is the father of evolution, and he defined evolution as descent, so coming down, with modification. And that to connect it to this term natural selection, the mechanism by which the change happens is natural selection. And the reason that it happens, it's due to, depending on the traits, depending on the phenotypes that exist within the population, some organisms are better suited for the environment and some organisms are less well suited for the environment. So the ones that are better suited have more babies, and we call that differential reproductive success. Now, if we thinking about where we just came from, and we just spent two entire units, Unit 5 and Unit 6, talking about genetics. And when Charles Darwin in the 1800s was defining evolution and talking about his observations and making claims about why what he observed, what the mechanisms were for what he observed, they didn't know about a lot of the underlying genetics, but now we do. And now we know that what's actually happening in natural selection, what's actually happening in evolution, is the variation that exists in population results from different versions of the same gene. We call those alleles. And populations change over time. That variation in population changes over time because there's change in those allele frequencies. So evolution actually is thinking about the genetics is just change in allele frequency over time. Now there's certain components, factors that need to be present so that evolution can occur. The first thing that has to be present is there actually has to be variation. There can't be any change if there isn't any variation. And the variation that exists has to be heritable. Not all variation is heritable. So there has to be heritable variation within. It's not about individuals. We're looking at variation of all phenotypes, and we call that a population. And we'll talk about what a population, the definition of a population is during this unit. That's the first thing that has to exist. So there has to be the differences, variation in the population. The second thing that has to exist is there has to be something that's choosing one of the variants over the other, one trait or the other. So there has to be some type of selection. And that, if we're talking about natural selection, that means the environment is selecting. But there are other forces that are going to select from the variation, and we'll talk about those. And then there also has to be time for all of it to happen. And we talk about the time as being evolutionary time, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a lot of time. There are some changes that happen relatively quickly, and it depends on several factors. What I want to do now is I want to diagram and talk about how some of the language for evolution fits together. So it'll give us a way to talk about the concepts that we'll talk about in this unit. So let's start by, as an overarching term, we're talking about evolution. So we'll put that at the top. Now we're going to talk about two different concepts or two different groups of information, piles of information in in chapter 22 to begin our conversation about evolution. And first we'll talk about the definition. It was defined by Charles Darwin as he used the term or the phrase descent with modification. And what he was trying to explain were two conflicting observations. And those observations were actually competed with each other. His first observation, and a lot of scientists at the time had observed, that there was this underlying similarity of organisms. You can think of it as the unity of life, that many, many organisms shared certain characteristics. But also in those observations, he saw a tremendous amount, and scientists saw a tremendous amount of biodiversity of life. So it's weird because you have this unity of sameness, and then you also have this tremendous amount of difference. And this idea of descent with modification attempted to explain those two conflicting observations. What he did was, and his contribution was, he actually, other scientists also attempted to explain, and evolution at the time had even been defined. But what he did was, he had a theory about what the mechanism was. How did it work? And he said that the mechanism is natural selection. Now, all of these ideas about evolution and the conclusions that he made are based on a tremendous amount of scientific evidence. Things like, for example, he started by looking actually at how humans select among variation and how we see shifts in allele frequencies because of that selection process. We call that artificial selection. And then also looking at organisms that lived in the past that are no longer living to try to trace change over time from long ago, and that's the fossil record. He also looked at similarities between organisms. We call those homologies. And those homologies, at the time, they were morphological, anatomical similarities, but now we look at molecular homologies as well. And they also looked at the similarity of organisms and where those organisms are located. We call that biogeography. And we'll talk about specific scientific evidence that supports the theory of evolution in a little bit. So just to clarify what descent with modification actually means, it means that if we think about what is descending, there are phenotypes. And the phenotypes of offspring are slightly different. That's the modification part. Then both parents and also each other. Now, natural selection and the descent refers to the passing down from parent to offspring. That's the descending piece. Natural selection, the definition of natural selection, is the mechanism of evolution. It's how allele frequencies are changing over time. And what's occurring is the natural environment, that's why it's called natural selection, is going to select for, that's the language we use, advantageous traits, so good traits. And good traits depend on that particular environment, and we'll talk about what that means. And then we use that same language. It's going to select against bad traits, or we call them disadvantageous traits. So natural selection is the mechanism of evolution. Okay, so Charles Darwin, he's this guy, the father, we call him the father of evolution, and he lived 1802 to 1882. So I'll put that in terms of long time ago, and we consider him the father of evolution. His idea, we base our understanding of evolution on his research, and he was a naturalist from England. And while other scientists at the time had a definition of evolution and had ideas about the way that what the underlying mechanisms were, he was the first to explain the mechanism as evolution that we accept now, which is natural selection. The mechanism of evolution, which is natural selection. When the environment is choosing which alleles are the advantages and which alleles are disadvantages. Okay. So let's see if we can put his key observations of organisms and of the environment and how this variation is being chosen into a diagram. Let's make a diagram. So what Darwin said was, in every population, there's overproduction of offspring. There's just too many babies. And within that population of too many babies, there is variation, and that variation is heritable. So there's heritable variation among the population. And within that heritable variation, within that overpopulation, there are, within a particular environment, the members of that population are going to compete for limited resources. Anytime there's competition, some organisms are going to be better at whatever the competition than others. Some are going to be winners and some are going to be losers. And we call the difference between the winners and the losers differential reproductive success. And what that means is that some organisms are not going to be able to compete, and some organisms are going to be able to compete. So we say that individuals with advantageous traits, so they have advantages that allow them to be more competitive, they produce more offspring. However, some organisms, individuals that have disadvantageous traits, they either die or they have fewer offspring. Okay, so now we have some of them coming out of the population and then this continuing up here. Now we've got all these individuals that had more offspring. And so what happens is we call those things that accumulate adaptations. So adaptations, those advantages accumulate. And then those organisms that have those advantageous traits make too many babies. And the same thing happens over and over and over again. Let's look at a specific example in beak size and shape. Beak size and shape. Here's a diagram that shows you what adaptive radiation looks like in finches in the Galapagos, where Charles Darwin traveled. So, like I said, the first thing that happens is you have overproduction of offspring. So, the overproduction of offspring is going to happen in the environment. We have overproduction, and that's happening in here. So, we have an environment of that is producing too many. In this case, we're looking at ground finches, birds. There's too many birds, and within those that particular population of birds, there's variation in the population. So there's variation in, now we're talking about beak size and shape. So there's different shapes and sizes of beaks. They're all the same ground finches, but there's some variation. Just like we have variation in hair color, they have variation in beak size and shape. Now, the beak size and shape, they're going to compete within that environment. So there's competition. So if you can imagine, some of the beaks are better at getting food and some of the beaks are not as good at getting food. So what happens is the environment, this right here is representing the environment. The environment selects, in this case, for the best beaks, for advantageous traits. And we can see what those are if we look at all these different birds. Now, over time, what happens is you end up with these different birds that are adapted to very specific environments. And so, for example, if we look at these birds right here, the large ground finch, the sharp beak ground finch, the medium ground finch, and the small round ground finch, they mostly eat seeds. And if you look at their beaks, they all kind of are the same tool if you look at them. But then if you look up here at these, cactus finch, and they eat cactus and seeds and parts, and their beaks are a slightly different shape. And then if we look up here at that are mostly eating insects, their beaks are shorter. And like, look at this one right here. This is a crazy looking beak, a little tiny skinny beak. Maybe they're eating inside flowers. They're eating the insects that are living inside flowers. So you end up with this tremendous amount of diversity that results, they are very specifically adapted to their particular environment. We call those adaptations. An adaptation is a specific match between an organism and, or I should say, between organisms and their environment as a result of natural selection over time. Now, the interesting thing about Darwin is one of his first pieces of evidence about the mechanism of natural selection actually came from not natural selection, but from artificial selection. So let's talk a little bit about artificial selection. Artificial selection is the process of humans being the selector. So humans act as the mechanism of selection for many different plants and animals. That's essentially what we're doing in agriculture. We are choosing desirable traits. We choose desirable traits. And so, we are looking for something, we want a sweet apple, or we want a red strawberry, or we want a big horse, or we want a fast horse, or we want a cute dog. And so humans are actually acting as the selective mechanism. And he used that evidence of how fast there can be change over time in an artificial environment. He used that same concept and applied it to the natural environment being the selector. Now, just to clarify, in artificial selection, the variation that exists in the population is not a result of humans, or it can be if we're genetically engineering things, but there is variation that exists in population. So the variation exists in the population already, as just a result of, as a result of changes in DNA. The changes in DNA are just random mutation. And that when farmers or humans choose from the variation, so we choose from existing variation. Like I said, we can genetically engineer, but we don't over time and for hundreds of years, we've been just choosing for existing variation. For example, if we look at wild mustard right here, all of cauliflower and broccoli and cabbage and kale and kohlrabi and Brussels sprouts, these all are from wild mustard. They're all the same species, and they're all just random mutations that resulted in weird deformities like sterile flowers, like suppression of flower development, like the space in between the buds is suppressed, so all the leaves come off the same spot. The much larger leaves, for example, and that's all the same species. They're all the same plant, and through artificial selection, we've just chosen these particular mutations. Now, the interesting thing about artificial selection is that they're not necessarily things that in the natural environment would be good. It's bad to have sterile flowers, but it's good to have sterile flowers if you like cauliflower. So you have to be careful in artificial selection. They're not necessarily things that in a natural environment will be good, but we plant cauliflower all the time. So we are choosing what differential reproductive success means. And if you're a sterile flower and you like white cauliflower, well, that's a bonus thing if you're cauliflower. Anyway, so just to clarify where the variation comes from and sort of emphasize what I was talking about here, all sources of variation come from random mutation. Now, we talk about variation resulting from sexual reproduction and from the combination of genetic material, but the actual underlying differences, how we get different versions of the same gene, why we have alleles, that all results from random mutation. However, we do get changes in phenotype as a result of recombination of traits. Now, in eukaryotic cells, recombination of traits results from sexual reproduction. But in prokaryotic cells, there's no sexual reproduction. However, there are ways that there is recombination of traits. There are 3 different ways, and they're all considered horizontal gene transfer, as opposed to vertical gene transfer, which is from parent to offspring, which it happens in sexual reproduction, but prokaryotic cells can't do that. So we have what's called horizontal gene transfer. So it's just a passing of genetic material from one organism to the next in the same generation. And there's 3 basic types of horizontal gene transfer. There's transformation, which is the uptake of DNA from the environment. It's called the exogenous uptake of DNA. So cells will take in DNA that's in the environment, and that's how plasmids are going to get passed back and forth by the process of transformation. And we can exploit that in the lab, but it actually happens in nature. And then transduction is another form of horizontal gene transfer. That's viral transfer of DNA. So a bacteriophage will inject its DNA into a bacteria cell, and transduction can happen in eukaryotic cells too. Viruses transfer their genetic material into eukaryotic cells. And then the last one is called conjugation. And conjugation is the passing of genetic material through a structure called, a temporary structure called a sex pilus, which is just this little tube, and they're going to pass little bits of DNA between two cells. And only some bacteria cells can make a sex pilus. It's a particular gene, several genes that are associated with the ability to do that, and they only do it under certain conditions. But you can induce bacteria to do it if you want them to pass DNA back and forth. But those are all considered horizontal gene transfer. But that's the actual source of variation is random mutation. And then traits can be combined either through quote unquote vertical gene transfer and then horizontal gene transfer. Anyway, okay, so what I want you to do now is I want you to go and stop the video and watch Rock Pocket Mouse and take some notes right here. The Rock Pocket Mouse video is on slide number 11. So go to slide number 11 and watch this Rock Pocket Mouse video right here. And then we will continue and talk about the discussion questions on page 3 when you're in class. And I hope this was helpful.